the capacity crunch that was Road Check Week. Hey everybody, welcome back. And today we are going to do a little bit of a reverse, I don't even know if it would be psychology, Dean. I'm not sure what it would be actually, now that I'm thinking about it, but it's a little reverse because we're going to talk about something that's already happened as opposed to Deaner's crystal ball that talks about stuff that has not happened yet. Dean, welcome, my man. How you doing?
Yeah, good. Great to be with you, Dan. Yeah, Road Check Week was last
Oh,
week.
you too.
We're down here at the DAT Symposium in Hilton Head, where we have our top brokers in, and most of them were talking about how hard it was to find capacity last week. And what was really interesting, Dan, it
Interesting.
was the same as last year. Week 20 of last year, there was a capacity crunch. Rates went through the roof, and through the roof is a relative term, from being flat for months in dry van, they went up like 7 cents a mile in the space of a week, which is kind of really unusual in this market. They did last year, they went up even more in week 20. Don't know if you remember, they went up about 10 cents a mile during Road Check Week. And it's one of those.
No, I don't. I didn't recall the final number, but can I ask you this, Dean, before we get into it? So, what was their main focus this year?
So it's a good. That's sort of a good segue into why this year it was braking systems again, and the mother of all mothers was controlled substances. So whenever they do hours of service, brakes to a degree, but really hours of service and anything to do with drugs, carriers take time off, and it's not because they're flagrantly breaking the law or doing things they shouldn't. It's just it's such an invasion of privacy. You don't want sniffer dogs in and around your workplace, which is your truck. It's such a, whenever they get in the cab. I said this on our show a month ago. I said, be very mindful that this Road Check Week we'll see capacity tighten. Carriers will just take time off because they do not want people in their living space. They do not want people nosing around inside their cab. And that's pretty much what
I could
happened.
see that because it's like such an invasion of privacy, and it's almost like somebody went through your underwear drawer kind of feeling. And
Dan, you in Road Check Week, you are guilty until proven innocent. Right? So that's how Road Check Week kind of pans out. Now I know that sounds strange, but they're looking for something that's wrong with your truck. Now, I totally agree with safety, brakes, all of those sorts of things. I just have a problem with some of the overzealous nature of this. That's just a personal opinion. But the reality is that carriers take time off not because they've got bad braking systems or whatever. In the ELD environment, it costs you a lot of time. And in particular, we talked to some brokers who really struggled to move trucks off the West Coast last week because with Road Check Week, when you think about California and Florida, very few roads in or out. Right? You've got four.
so no matter what, you're getting caught.
Yeah, so you've got two northbound roads coming out of Florida, and off the West Coast, where produce season's starting to ramp up, you've got 80 and then 40 and 15. That's it. And so the authorities camp out there, and you can expect really serious delays to your produce coming off those coasts. That's if the carriers are going to work. So what happened, and I've got some really interesting data points here to share with you, being Day-to-Day Wednesday. The data shows that load posts increased about 30% last week. So that's load posts on our load board aren't the same as loads moved, right? Because you can have multiple load posts for a load. But the higher the load posts, it's a reflection of how many times brokers have to post a load to find a truck. So it's a proxy for tight capacity and higher demand in the market. So load posts went up, carrier equipment posts dropped because there's fewer carriers around, and then rates went up. And I'll quote you some numbers here. The national average rate surged. I said a minute ago it was up 6 cents to 163. It's still 4 cents a mile lower than last year. Even our top 50 lanes went up 8 cents a mile last week. Now, That's about 32 cents a mile higher than the national average. Reefer rates went up the most. They went up 8 cents a mile. It's still about 8 cents a mile lower than last year, but the impact was the same on the load post side of the market. There was just and people say, well, how can so few trucks taking time off move the spot market so much? Right? It's a really interesting discussion. So is it that you just have thousands and thousands of truckers staying home for the week? And the answer is yes. That's pretty much what they do. And it's a good time to do maintenance, take time off. Road Check Week is called, it's a safety blitz of sorts. The difference this year, Dan, is that I saw Safety Blitz start a week earlier because normally it's a 72-hour period, and it's like it was the middle of last week, but I was on the road in my truck the week before, and they were out in force doing level 1 inspections. So I think there's the blitz is part of a nationwide. They'll do tens of thousands. I think they might do 29, 30,000 inspections over the course of the time, and it's just one of these amazing phenomenons where carriers take time off, and they always take more time off whenever it's got to do with hours of service or in this case, controlled substances. It's always the way.
It's interesting, Dean, because I mean, if you look at every industry, you look at the construction industry, right? At the end of August, they have a construction shutdown,
Right.
right? Is it the end of August or end of July? But I know there's like a 2 week period, especially in Canada, where it's a construction shutdown.
Right.
And, if you think about it, so two things. The first thing that comes to my mind is, well, yeah, because trucking never stops. So as a truck driver, it's not as if you have, um, a period where you go, okay, I'm going to, it's always slow during this time because depending on what commodity you're in, you're slow at different times, right? And I see it as a perfect time for anyone to take time off if they're like, well, I can be on the road this week, but I'll spend half my time sitting,
Right.
having people go through my stuff. And then on the flip side of that, where you said it started a week early, I'm wondering if it starts early, and love your thoughts on this, is because they know a lot of drivers will be taking that week off. So we may as well start early and see if we can get anybody.
Absolutely, Dan. Absolutely. I think it's a game of cat and mouse. I think that's exactly what was happening.
Mm,
I had the same thought when I was seeing them out doing the level 1s on the week before. And I mean, they do this all the year round, and some states have more enforcement than others. Um, there is a way, so enforcement is not even across the country. When you divide the number of inspections by the number of lane miles, you get a sense of the inspection severity per lane mile by state, right? So the fact that you have more inspections in California and Texas shouldn't surprise anybody because they're the biggest states, but they're not the states that have the highest number of inspections per mile, right? So the smaller states, yeah,
interesting.
some of the states like Ohio, Indiana in particular, the road south out of Chicago on that sort of Atlanta run, particularly aggressive. It's a bit of a bottleneck, like a funnel, because you've only got one road sort of running south where a lot of high volume trucks run, and it's a 2-lane highway, like sort of 2 lanes each way. It's just you have a lot of traffic and a lot of inspection activity. I talk to truck drivers about that, and they kind of talk about these stories about how, back in the day, some truck driver did something really egregious and got all the authorities offside, and ever since then they've been, after truckers. That is certainly feasible. I know that's happened a lot, and it wouldn't surprise me if some of the enforcement folks have got an eye out for some fleets. Because some fleets do behave differently than others. So yes, Dan, I think they're changing their
Yeah.
behaviour. Um, don't forget they have a lot more technology these days, a lot of weigh-in-motion technology, a lot of passive detectors on the roadside, embedded in the road, a lot of cameras. So they've got a lot more intelligence about when and where trucks run and how heavy they are. And I think that's enabled them to be more targeted about where they set up their locations. But the net of it is
Yeah.
spot market capacity tightened. And maybe I give you some math behind why rates went up so much last week if all of these trucks took time off. And I think this is a really good segue to sort of the broader market. which is why does the movement of rates in the spot market lead the rest of the market? Why is it a leading indicator? Well, let's say you've got 100 trucks, and in the typical market like this, 85% of loads are contract, 15% spot. So if you had 100 trucks, you'd have 85 in the contract market and 15 trucks running in the spot market, right? And let's say you lost 5 trucks. Let's say we reduced the market by 5 trucks. But if those 5 trucks
Hmm.
were all in the spot market, that's a 33% reduction in capacity in the spot market.
Yes.
Now, you multiply that across tens of thousands of fleets, and the reason that carriers exiting the market and coming into the market in the spot market in, reasonably high numbers, if they're all in the spot market or mostly in the spot market, it moves spot market capacity much more than it does the contract market. So that's why Road Check Week can move the spot market rate needle so much, because it doesn't take a lot of carrier fluctuation in a smaller percentage of total volume. So that's why we track carriers coming in and out of the market so aggressively, because we know that capacity can tighten or loosen the fastest in the spot market. So it's a really good leading indicator for where
Mm.
the rest of the market's going. So I expect rates to come way back down again this week, just like they did last year. So they'll cool off this week and go back to their normal sort of malaise pattern that they've been in. Um, it's certainly not, it's sort of a bit of a, that I think, Dan, this is a really interesting thing for those that are sort of listening, that are buying capacity and doing, sort of third party logistics work. It doesn't take much to really shock this market. So like RoadCheck is an
Mm.
example of a shock, right? So it was kind of a short, like the polar vortex in middle of January this year was a shock to the market, and rates sort of skyrocketed and came back down. RoadCheck Week did the same. Um, Last year, a broker said to me yesterday, last year when Road Check Week hit, the market never settled down. Capacity just got tight, and it kind of, as demand sort of picked up seasonally, rates were sort of elevated for the rest of the year. It's interesting to see if that's what happens this year. But we're sort of, as capacity exits the market, I think this is a really important point to sort of consider. I think capacity is going to get tighter and tighter in the spot market as the year goes on. And I just think if you're looking for capacity, as the market shrinks in capacity, I think you're going to have to work harder to make sure you've got those relationships with your carrier network and with your shippers to make sure you've got some capacity to move their freight when these shocks hit. Because it won't take much to move
Yeah.
this market, I don't think, when everything is so tight. And I don't mean tight in terms of capacity, I mean tight in terms of margins, tight in terms of the number of trucks on the road. They're getting closer to the number of loads. We're sort of in this trough where the market's bottoming out. Um, Dan, the other thing that's kind of blown me away is people are already pre-buying 2027. They're pre-buying Class 8 trucks ahead of the 2027 clean truck emission standard that comes in. Now, I don't know if you remember. Do you remember 2007 was the first year of DPF filters, the diesel particulate filters that came
Yes.
in? Well, there was a massive
Yep.
pre-buy in trucks in late '05, early '06. In fact, 2006 was the highest year ever for Class 8 truck production. 2006, ahead of the pre-buy. Now, the pre-buy, the 2007 DPF trucks were a bit of a nightmare for fleets because they cost about $7,000 extra per truck, and they reduced fuel economy by about 3%. And that lasted 3 or 4 years until fleets figured out, or until, more importantly, engine makers figured out how to get this right. Because they rushed this into the market. What fleets are worried about now is a repeat of that with the 2027 truck, because what they're doing this time, Dan, is they estimate the 2027 emission standards will add 30 grand to the price of a new truck.
You know what, Dean? It's interesting you say that because I was just about to say I'm wondering how much the price is going to increase, because it seems like these days, anyways, every single little tiny thing that they have to do differently, like, severely raises the price
Right.
of everything.
Well, so Dan, this time around they're talking about cylinder deactivation, dual catalytic converters, heated DEF fluid, right? So it's all about trying to burn off the fine particulates, faster. Diesel cylinder deactivation is kind of fascinating. If you've got 6 cylinders, you'll deactivate 2 of them under low load. Like, think about a hybrid car with a
Yep.
battery that cuts in and out. Dan, I don't know that engine blocks are designed to handle just 4 cylinders or 3 cylinders doing all of the work. I don't know that that technology is there yet. I think that's the concern: is are trucks just going to run? Are they going to have a carrier's going to be on the bleeding edge and dealing with all of these maintenance issues because these new trucks are going to wear out faster? That's sort of the concern, because when you add more resistance to the flow of exhaust gases, the trucks just run hotter. They don't last longer. So I think
Yep.
so. So this, I guess where I'm going to with this, we're already seeing private fleets buy, a higher proportion of Class 8 trucks out of factories ahead of this. There's a pre-buy going on with private fleets. Why that's important? Private fleets have an 8 to 9 year trade cycle, whereas truckload carriers are 3 years. So a private fleet's going to hold a truck much longer, and
Okay.
pre-buy now spans 2027, right? So they're already pre-buying now. So
Yep.
what does more private fleet mean for all of us? Well, more private fleet simply means that you've got less freight going into um, the spot market, because you've got private fleets handling more of the freight on their own. So you've got more sort of that dedicated contract freight. So that's sort of, to me, that's interesting, because if you're thinking about the spot market bouncing back, and meanwhile you've got shippers putting more freight into their private fleets and less into the broader spot market, I think that's a really interesting thing to be thinking about.
So I agree. I mean, I remember vividly my first interaction with a private fleet. And it was a gentleman that actually called me back in the day when I was posting on the load board. And he was like, "Well, it's my truck." And I'm like, "Okay, but I've never heard of you before, because it's like an actual company."
Right,
And so what he was doing was he was sending out his product on his truck. When he would get to destination, he would find a load broker load to come back.
right,
Like, he'd go on a load board and find a load to come back. And I remember being actually really taken back by it and saying, "Wow, okay, talk to me. Like, is this a good thing?" And he says, "Dan, sometimes it works great." He goes, "Other times we lose our shirts." And he says, and this to me has always been the challenge, I'm going to say, not necessarily problem, but challenge when it comes to private fleet. Like, how big is your supply chain environment? And where does, for lack of a better term, the penny drop when it comes to that private fleet? Like, is it just doing local deliveries, local P&D? Like, I've had customers where they own all of their local trucks
right,
just for P&D, and they do it because they GPS it, they speed limit them, they know exactly where their team is. Digitally, they can do everything on a keyboard, and it just adds to that value that they bring to the client,
yep,
right? On that piece. But everything else, they're like, "No, we're not touching," because sure, we can do A to B, but when you're at B, how do you get back to A, or how do
yeah,
you go to C and then to
yeah,
D? And this is where um, these fleets that I've had conversations with, anyways, they're back to the Cracker Jack scenario,
right, right,
right? So I'm sure most of the time, a lot of asset-based companies call broker freight Cracker Jack freight, because they never know what kind of surprise they're going to get in the box, right?
right,
And to me, it was always hilarious, because it's true. I
right,
mean, how many times do asset-based companies come in, they grab an order which is nothing like what they said they would grab? Do you know what I mean? So
yeah.
it's this piece of it, and it's interesting, because I hear a lot more companies these days, especially in my outreach and speaking to companies. It's like, "No, we're doing our own freight."
Yeah.
And I think the pandemic ushered a lot of that in as well,
Oh, it did.
right? Because then now you have control over your numbers.
Right, and customer service and your pricing. And don't forget, on our show about 3 months ago, we talked about fleets like Werner in their earnings calls, talking about, we want to grow our. They had 60% of their trucks are in dedicated, which was a really surprise to me. They want to grow that, though. They want to grow their dedicated fleet. If you've got dedicated contract freight with shippers, it's you take a lot of that overflow out of the market, that kind of hits the spot market. So that's where, absent any shock
Hmm.
in demand to the market, to me, it feels like it's going to be a fairly flat year in the spot market this year. We still don't see any demand signals. I think there's an exodus of carriers that's still, going on but slowing down. And to me, this is sort of my gut instinct, Dan. It just tells me that finding trucks in the spot market is going to be much harder this year because there's going to be far fewer people left standing and far fewer people left willing to haul ridiculously cheap freight. Because I think the ones left standing now are ones that really know how to run a business. That's sort of my take on it.
Yeah, I agree, and I actually really hope it happens like that, Dean, because I've found in the past, anyways, and hopefully things have changed with everybody's mindset over the last couple of years. But in the past, like if you go back to 2018, 19, um, when people were posting and offering up loads like $350 from Toronto to Montreal. And I remember friends of mine saying, like that own trucking company saying, Dad, it's absolutely ridiculous. But the problem is somebody's going to take it. And I really hope that, depending on what online forum and community you're on, I'm on a particular one um, where a lot of these companies are saying, well, I'm not taking it. I'd rather just not make the money. I'm not taking it because I'm not contributing to
Right.
the shortfall in the market because it's as well as I do because you've dealt with enough customers. If a lane is $1,500 and one day the customer gets it for 900 or 1,000, that's the new rate
Right.
is 900 or 1,000, and that's the benchmark that they're always going to try and pay. And I think it's this balancing act, right? In everything logistics is always a balancing act. It's a balance between how little can the customer pay to get the job done, but how much can the supplier or the carrier, and I'm going to say both on a broker and an asset side, get
Yep.
to make this lane profitable. And it's this constant juxtaposition. It's like it's constant juggle. And I guess that's part of deregulation. But
Yeah.
um, to me, I I hope what's going to happen with this next cleansing, if you will, because we've talked about it many times about this idea of the cleansing. I hope it's going to bring the real talented people to the forefront.
Right.
I really do, because I think that's what we need right now.
Yeah. It was interesting talking to brokers yesterday. They're kind of, this isn't their first market cycle. They've been around for a while. What it really feels like to me is those that are going to be still in this business by the end of this year are going to be in a very different negotiating position, Dan. I'm already seeing it with carriers right now that did so well during the pandemic. They're being more choosy. Not everybody's behaving the same way, and I think that points to a different capacity behavior. As we get into the busier part of this next year, I just think I really sense the second half of this year. It's going to be really hard to find trucks, for those that are in the 3PL space. I think
Hmm.
it's going to be much harder. And maybe it's going to be harder to find freight if shippers, have a bigger chunk of their freight with dedicated carriers, because that takes a lot of the uncertainty out of the
Hmm.
market. And we had Lee Klaskow from Bloomberg on our panel yesterday here at the DAT symposium, and he's a really well respected economist, transport economist, and he and Professor Kaplis from MIT, they don't think any improvement in the market is certainly next year, and I think it's the second quarter of next year. But heck, I've been wrong on this. Everybody's been wrong on predicting when this market will turn. But they're already talking about, in a year's time, this market should show some signs of improving. I mean, Dan, that's a long time away.
Yeah, it is. It is. But you know what, Dean? Like, you've been around long enough um, where I've seen it almost every 10 years. Almost every decade,
Right,
there's a
right,
huge blip in this environment, in the logistics environment, or let's go supply chain environment
right,
as opposed to logistics, right? Like if we look at it, it was 18 into 19. Now, obviously, it's not. 10 years from there. But before that, it was 2008 and 9.
Right.
Right. And I think this is a consistent thing where now I think this one
Yeah.
has lasted longer
Oh, yeah.
than any other one, because even if you look at like, so 2008 during that cycle, 2008 is where the bottom started to fall out. I think a lot of that shock wave, if you will, was 2009.
Yep.
Then 2010, things started to slowly turn. By 2011, it felt like the industry was back. Right. Then we get to 2019. So it was almost 10 years.
Right.
2018, that was more of an ELD thing, but there's always something that hits the market, right? 2020 COVID. And
So,
I think the shock wave of COVID is longer.
yeah.
And again, you know,
Yeah.
my own personal opinion, I think it's longer because the shock was higher,
Yeah. Exactly.
right? So if you have like a
Yep.
14 Richter scale earthquake,
Right. Right.
those shock waves are going to last longer. And so I think where as many people are trying their best to predict,
Right.
that long tail of the initial shock, I don't think was taken into consideration,
Oh,
or people thought it would rebound fast.
Oh, we all thought it would rebound faster. I mean, I thought seasonality would come back in much stronger and change some of the market fundamentals this year. That hasn't happened because I think, and I don't know that I underestimated it, but it certainly surprised me how well off carriers have been and how long they've been able to weather high diesel prices. How much profit they made. Now, at some point, that money runs out. But I think we're heading into a period. So, Dan, when you look at the volatility of the pandemic, right? So, if you look at the rate inflection of 16, 17, 18, 19, and then the pandemic, you can see that the market cycles were getting shorter, but the volatility, they'd go up much faster and higher and then down much faster and higher. So you had a lot more volatility. What remains to be seen if we see that market reaction speed increase because we've got all this technology and we're very vulnerable to shocks in the market. And I think that's I think the next shock, absent a disastrous hurricane season, the next shock on the market that I see coming is speed limiters for all trucks. I think that's the thing I'm
Mm-hmm.
particularly worried about from a carrier perspective. When ELDs were coming in December 17, Dan, carriers were already leaving the industry in 2016. The old timers said, you know what, I'm
Yep.
out. We were surveying, I was at Lancer Insurance, we were surveying our carriers at the time, and they were already leaving in 2016. They would said, no, we're not doing this.
Mm-hmm.
The same's going to happen with speed limiters,
Mm-hmm.
but probably in bigger numbers because this starts to affect your economics of running a business because the economics are that a large speed limited fleet's going to run, if they run 400 miles a day, the spot market unspeed limited guy's running 600. They're running 50% more miles per day. And that adds a lot more capacity to the market. The point is that if you put speed limiters on all trucks, you reduce capacity in the spot market dramatically. And that's going to be a big shock to the
Mm-hmm.
market, notwithstanding the fact that the turtle races will be on because everybody will be driving in both lanes at the same speed, holding up traffic all over the country. And that's going to drive car drivers absolutely insane. And that's part of the reason you'll have so many more accidents. That aside, the capacity impact down, I think, will be substantial. And that's, to me, that's a ELD level shock to the market and some. Because this is a really big deal, is the speed side of the equation.
I think so. And Dean, this is one thing I've said for ages. Legit, like trucking is the only industry where the government can come in and say, okay, by the way, we're taking X amount of salary away from you, because in essence that's what it was when they changed the HOS. That's what it was. I mean, if you think about it, I don't know if you remember when they changed hours of service, but there was a report that came out that I think Walmart needed 10,000 more drivers just to complete the supply chain the way it was. And so you look at when the hours of service change, and it's telling the person that's trying to feed their family, okay, so you're going to have to be out the same amount of time, but you're going to make this much less,
Right.
right? And then now with governing it, if somebody's paid per mile, you're saying, okay, again, you're going to be out all week, but you're going to go from here to here on what you can make because you're governed. And I don't know. To me, I think it's wrong, especially when we're looking at this industry,
Right.
because this industry runs the planet. Let's call a spade a spade. Without it, we don't eat, we don't have fresh drinking, like nothing happens without like trucking.
Right.
And I don't know. I mean, we can this would be like an entire week's worth of shows, but it's just it's pathetic, and it's very disturbing
Yeah.
to see that they're doing all of this.
Yeah.
You have the data. You've shown that it's not trucks typically that are causing all of these accidents. So why is it always the trucking industry?
Well, it's
It's always the trucking industry's fault.
yeah, it's a lot of it's driven by attorneys and litigation and fear of punitive damages. I mean, that's why they're all adamant they need to be compliant to regulations, despite the unsafe nature of some of the hours of service regulations. Being compliant to it helps you defend yourself in court.
Hmm.
So it's not necessarily that we want to be safer.
Yeah.
They'll say that, but that's not how the numbers pan out. Everybody knows that's on the road that in the post ELD environment, drivers are driving more dangerously. They're more risky. They take more chances. They rush more. They cut people off more. The worst of all, Dan, is they pull up for
Hmm.
their 30-minute break in the breakdown lane. Like in the breakdown lane, having a 30-minute break, sitting in the passenger seat. It's like this unintended consequence of the ELD regulation was now suddenly drivers pulling up in the middle of nowhere because they get caught in between rest areas or haven't trip planned properly. So
Yeah.
there's stuff going on out here that just makes no sense to all of the professional drivers on the road. And I think what we're about to see is a very different, capacity market. We saw a massive influx of opportunistic capacity during the pandemic. That has largely disappeared. You're going to be left with market fundamentals that rates are not going to be much higher than where they were in 2019. Operating costs are higher. You're going to have to be very good at running a business. I don't think whether it be on the broker or the carrier
Hmm.
side, you've got to be very good at managing costs and being very selective about who you work for. I think that's going to be the story of the market the rest of the year.
I agree.
Yeah.
I agree.